Marcus Tullius Cicero, De Officiis, Book 1, 1 to 60. Marcus, my son, you have been a pupil of Cratipus's for a year already, and that in Athens. Consequently, you ought to be filled to overflowing with philosophical advice and instruction, through the great authority of both teacher and city. The former can improve you with his knowledge, the latter by her examples. However, since I myself have always found it beneficial to combine things Latin with things Greek, something I have done not only in philosophy but also in the practice of rhetoric, I think you should do the same, that you may be equally capable in either language. In this respect I have, it seems to me, provided a great service to my countrymen. As a result, not only those ignorant of the Greek language, but the learned also, think that they have found some assistance both in learning and in making decisions. And you will certainly learn from the leading philosopher of our present generation, and you will go on doing so for as long as you like. You ought, of course, to want to learn for as long as you are not dissatisfied with your progress. However, my writings do not differ greatly from those of the Peripatetics, for we both want to be Socratics and Platonists. When you read them, therefore, though you must use your own judgment about the content, for I shall not prevent that, you will at least acquire a richer style of Latin prose by reading my work. I would not like it to be thought that I say this arrogantly, for I grant that many others surpass my knowledge of philosophy. And if, when I have devoted the best part of my life to oratory, I then claim for myself what is proper to an orator, that I speak suitably, clearly, and elegantly, I seem to have some right to lay such a claim. I strongly urge you, therefore, my dear Cicero, assiduously to read not only my speeches, but also the philosophical works, which are now almost equal to them. The language is more forceful in the former, but the calm and restrained style of the latter ought also to be cultivated. Furthermore, I see that it has not happened to this day that the same Greek has labored in both fields, pursuing both forensic oratory and also the other, quieter sort of debating. Perhaps Demetrius of Phalerum can be counted as doing so, a man of precise argument and an orator who, though not over-vigorous, spoke so pleasantly that you can recognize him as a pupil of Theophrastus. My achievement in either field is for others to judge, but there is no doubt that I have pursued them both. I certainly think that Plato, if he had wanted to try his hand at forensic oratory, would have been able to speak weightily and expansively. Conversely, if Demosthenes had held on to the things he learned from Plato, and had wanted to articulate them, he could have done so elegantly and with brilliance. I make the same judgment about Aristotle and Isocrates, each, because he so enjoyed his own pursuit, despised the other one. Now, when I had decided to write something for you at the present time, and much more in the future, I very much wanted to begin with something which was preeminently suitable to your age and my authority. Many weighty and beneficial matters in philosophy have been discussed accurately and expensively by philosophers. However, it is their teachings and their advice on the question of duties that seem to have the widest application. For no part of life, neither public affairs nor private, neither in the forum nor at home, neither when acting on your own nor in dealings with another, can be free from duty. Everything that is honorable in a life depends upon its cultivation, and everything dishonorable upon its neglect. The debate is one in which all philosophers share. For who would dare to call himself a philosopher if he had handed down no rules of duty? But there are some teachings that undermine all duty by the ends of good and evil things that they propound. The man who defines the highest good in such a way that it has no connection with virtue, measuring it by his own advantages rather than by honorableness, cannot, if he is in agreement with himself and is not occasionally overcome by the goodness of his own nature, cultivate either friendship or justice or liberality. There can certainly be no brave man who judges that pain is the greatest evil, nor a man of restraint who defines pleasure as the highest good. All that is so obvious that the matter does not need to be debated, but I have in any case discussed it elsewhere. If such a system of teaching were wanting to be consistent, they could say nothing about duty. Nor can any advice on duty that is steady, stable, and joined to nature be handed down except by those who believe that what is to be sought for its own sake is, as some say, honorableness alone, or, as others say, honorableness above all. Therefore, the giving of such advice is the peculiar province of the Stoics, Aristotelians, and Peripatetics, since the opinions of Aristo, Pyrrho, and Arillus have long since been driven out. They would have had the right to dispute about duty if they had left any means of choice between things, so that there might be a path to the discovering of duty. I shall, therefore, for the present and on this question, follow the Stoics above all, not as an expositor, but, as is my custom, drawing from their fountains when and as it seems best, using my own judgment and discretion. Since the whole discussion is going to be about duty, I propose first to define what duty is. I am surprised that Pernicius omitted to do this, for every piece of rational instruction upon any matter ought to begin with a definition, so that everyone understands what the subject of discussion is. The whole debate about duty is twofold. One kind of question relates to the end of good things. The other depends upon advice by which one ought to be fortified for all areas of life. The following are examples of the former. Are all duties complete? Is one duty more important than another? And other questions of that type. The duties for which advice has been offered do indeed relate to the end of good things, but here it is less obvious, because they appear rather to have in view instruction for a life that is shared. It is these that I must expound in these books. There is also another division to be made concerning duty, for a duty can be called either middle or complete. Complete duty we may, I think, label right, as the Greeks call it katorthoma, while the duty that is shared they call kathekon. They give their definitions in such a way as to define complete duty as what is right, while middle duty, they say, is that for which a persuasive reason can be given as to why it has been done. There are, in consequence, as it seems to Pernicius, three questions to deliberate when deciding upon a plan of action. In the first place, man may be uncertain whether the thing that falls under consideration is an honorable or a dishonorable thing to do. Often, when they ponder this, their spirits are pulled between opposing opinions. Secondly, they investigate or debate whether or not the course they are considering is conducive to the advantageousness and pleasantness of life. to opportunities and resources for doing things, to wealth and to power, all of which enable them to benefit themselves and those dear to them. All such deliberation falls under reasoning about what is beneficial. The third type of uncertainty arises when something apparently beneficial appears to conflict with what is honorable. Benefit seems to snatch you to its side, and honorableness in its turn to call you back. Consequently, the spirit is pulled this way and that in its deliberation, and it arouses in its reflection a care that is double-edged. Although it is a very great fault to omit anything when categorizing, this division leaves out two things. For one often deliberates not only whether a thing is honorable or dishonorable, but also which of two proposed courses that are honorable is the more honorable, or of two that are beneficial, the more beneficial. Therefore, the method that Pernicius thought should be threefold turns out to require division into 5 parts. First, therefore, we must discuss what is honorable by asking of it 2 questions, then what is beneficial by a parallel method, and then the comparison of the two. From the beginning, nature has assigned to every type of creature the tendency to preserve itself, its life and body, and to reject anything that seems likely to harm them, seeking and procuring everything necessary for life, such as nourishment, shelter, and so on. Common also to all animals is the impulse to unite for the purpose of procreation, and a certain care for those that are born. The great difference between man and beast, however, is this. The latter adapts itself only in responding to the senses, and only to something that is present and at hand, scarcely aware of the past or future. Man, however, is a sharer in reason. This enables him to perceive consequences, to comprehend the causes of things, their precursors and their antecedents, so to speak, to compare similarities, and to link and combine future with present events, and by seeing with ease the whole course of life, to prepare whatever is necessary for living it. The same nature, by the power of reason, unites one man to another for the fellowship both of common speech and of life, creating above all a particular love for his offspring. It drives him to desire that men should meet together and congregate, and that he should join them himself, and for the same reason to devote himself to providing whatever may contribute to the comfort and sustenance not only of himself, but also of his wife, his children, and others whom he holds dear and ought to protect. Furthermore, such concern also arouses men's spirits, rendering them greater for achieving whatever they attempt. The search for truth and its investigation are, above all, peculiar to man. Therefore, whenever we are free from necessary business and other concerns, we are eager to see or to hear or to learn, considering that the discovery of obscure, wonderful things is necessary for a blessed life. Consequently, we understand that what is true, simple, and pure is most fitted to the nature of man. In addition to this desire for seeing the truth, there is a kind of impulse towards preeminence, so that a spirit that is well trained by nature will not be willing to obey for its own benefit someone whose advice, teaching, and commands are not just and lawful. Greatness of spirit and a disdain for human things arise as a result. The power of nature and reason is not insignificant in this too, that this one animal alone perceives what order there is, what seemliness, what limit to words and deeds. No other animal, therefore, perceives the beauty, the loveliness, and the congruence of the parts of the things that sight perceives. Nature and reason transfer this, by analogy, from the eyes to the mind, thinking that beauty, constancy, and order should be preserved, and much more so in one's decisions and one's deeds. They are careful also to do nothing in an unseemly or effeminate way, in all their opinions and actions, thinking and doing nothing licentiously. The honorableness that we seek is created from and accomplished by these things. Even if it is not accorded acclaim, it is still honorable, and, as we truly claim, even if no one praises it, it is by nature worthy of praise. You are seeing, my son, the very face and form, so to speak, of the honorable. If it could be seen with the eyes, as Plato says, it would inspire an amazing love of wisdom. Everything that is honorable arises from one of four parts. It is involved either with the perception of truth and with ingenuity, or with preserving fellowship among men, with assigning to each his own, and with faithfulness to agreements one has made, or with the greatness and strength of a lofty and unconquered spirit, or with order and limit in everything that is said and done. Modesty and restraint are included here. Although these four are bound together and interwoven, certain kinds of duty have their origin in each individually. For example, in the part that we described as first, in which we placed wisdom and good sense, there lied the investigation and discovery of what is true, and that is a peculiar function of that virtue. For when a man is extremely good at perceiving what is most true in each particular thing, and when he is able, with great acuity and speed, to see and to explain the reason, then he is rightly considered extremely sensible and wise. Therefore, the thing that underlies this virtue, the matter as it were that it handles and treats, is truth. As for the other three virtues, their aim is necessities. They are to procure and to conserve whatever is required for the activities of life, in order both to preserve the fellowship and bonding between men, and to allow excellence and greatness of spirit to shine out, both in increasing influence and in acquiring benefits for oneself and those dear to one, and also, and much more, in disdaining the very same things. Again, order, constancy, moderation, and the qualities similar to these are associated with the group that requires not only mental activity, but also some action. For we shall conserve honorableness and seemliness if we apply some limit and order to the things with which we deal in our life. We have divided the nature and power of that which is honorable under four headings. The first of these, that consisting of the learning of truth, most closely relates to human nature. For all of us feel the pull that leads us to desire to learn and to know. We think it a fine thing to excel in this, while considering it bad and dishonorable to stumble, to wander, to be ignorant, to be deceived. In this category, which is both natural and honorable, one must avoid two faults. First, we should not take things that have not been ascertained for things that have, and rashly assent to them. Everyone who wants to avoid that fault, as everyone indeed should, will take time and care when he ponders any matter. The second fault is that some men bestow excessive devotion and effort upon matters that are both abstruse and difficult and unnecessary. When those faults are avoided, then the amount of effort and care that is given to things honorable and worth learning will rightly be praised. Just as we have heard happen regarding Gaius Sulpicius in astronomy, and as we have learned ourselves regarding Sextus Pompeius in geometry, many men in dialectical arguments, and yet more in civil law. For these arts are all associated with the investigation of what is true. It is, however, contrary to duty to be drawn by such a devotion away from practical achievements. All the praise that belongs to virtue lies in action. On the other hand, there is often a break from it, and we are given many opportunities to return to our studies. Besides, the activity of the mind, which is never at rest, can maintain in us our pursuit of learning, even without effort on our part. For reflective movements of the spirit occur in one of two ways: either when taking counsel about honorable matters that pertain to living well and blessedly, or in the pursuit of knowledge and learning. We have now discussed the first source of duty. Of the three that remain, the most wide-reaching one is the reasoning by which the fellowship of men with one another and the communal life are held together. There are two parts of this: justice, the most illustrious of the virtues, on account of which men are called good, and the beneficence connected with it, which may be called either kindness or liberality. Of justice, the first office is that no man should harm another unless he has been provoked by injustice. The next, that one should treat common goods as common and private ones as one's own. Now, no property is private by nature, but rather by long occupation, as when men moved into some empty property in the past, or by victory, when they acquired it in war, or by law, by settlement, by agreement, or by lot. The result is that the land of Arpinum is said to belong to the Arpinids, and that of Tusculum to the Tusculani. The distribution of private property is of a similar kind. Consequently, since what becomes each man's own comes from what had in nature been common, each man should hold on to whatever has fallen to him. If anyone else should seek any of it for himself, he will be violating the law of human fellowship. We are not born for ourselves alone, to use Plato's splendid words, but our country claims for itself one part of our birth, and our friends another. Moreover, as the Stoics believe, everything produced on the earth is created for the use of mankind, and men are born for the sake of men, so that they may be able to assist one another. Consequently, we ought, in this, to follow nature as our leader, to contribute to the common stock the things that benefit everyone together, and by the exchange of dutiful services, by giving and receiving expertise and effort and means, to bind fast the fellowship of men with each other. Moreover, the keeping of faith is fundamental to justice, that is, constancy and truth in what is said and agreed. Therefore, though this will perhaps seem difficult to some, let us venture to imitate the Stoics, who hunt assiduously for the derivations of words, and let us trust that keeping faith, fides, is so called because what has been said is actually done, fiat. Of injustice, there are two types. Man may inflict injury, or else, when it is being inflicted upon others, they may fail to deflect it, even though they could. Anyone who makes an unjust attack on another, whether driven by anger or by some other agitation, seems to be laying hands, so to speak, upon a fellow. But also, the man who does not defend someone, or obstruct the injustice when he can, is at fault, just as if he had abandoned his parents or his friends or his country. Those injustices that are purposely inflicted for the sake of harming another often stem from fear. In such cases, the one who is thinking of harming someone else is afraid that if he does not do so, he himself will be affected by some disadvantage. In most cases, however, men set about committing injustice in order to secure something that they desire. Where this fault is concerned, avarice is extremely widespread. Riches are sought both for the things that are necessary to life and in order to enjoy pleasures. In men of greater spirit, however, the desire for wealth has as its goal influence and the opportunity to gratify others. Marcus Crassus, for example, recently said that no one who wanted to be preeminent in the Republic would have wealth enough if he could not feed an army on its yield. Magnificent accoutrements and an elegant and plentiful style of life give men further delight. The result of such things is that desire for money has become unlimited. Such expansion of one's personal wealth as harms no one is not, of course, to be disparaged, but committing injustice must always be avoided. However, men are led most of all to being overwhelmed by forgetfulness of justice when they slip into desiring positions of command or honor or glory. That is why we find the observation of Aeneas to be widely applicable. To kingship belongs neither sacred fellowship nor faith. For if there is any area in which it is impossible for many to be outstanding, there will generally be such competition there that it is extremely difficult to maintain a sacred fellowship. The rash behavior of Gaius Caesar has recently made that clear. He overturned all the laws of gods and men for the sake of the preeminence that he had imagined for himself in his mistaken fancy. There is something troubling in this type of case, in that the desire for honor, command, power, and glory usually exist in men of the greatest spirit and most brilliant intellectual talent. Therefore, one must be all the more careful not to do wrong in this way. In every case of injustice, it matters a great deal whether the injury was committed through some agitation of the spirit, which is generally brief and momentary, or purposefully and with forethought. For those things that happen because of some sudden impulse are less serious than those inflicted upon reflection and preparation. But I have now said enough about actually committing injustice. As for neglecting to defend others and deserting one's duty, there tend to be several causes for this. For some men do not wish to incur enmities or toil or expense. Others are hindered by indifference, laziness, inactivity, or some pursuits of business of their own, to the extent that they allow the people whom they ought to protect to be abandoned. We must therefore watch out in case Plato's words about philosophers prove not to be sufficient. For he said that they are immersed in the investigation of the truth, and that, disdaining the very things for which most men vigorously strive and even fight one another to the death, they count them as nothing. Because of that, he calls them just. They observe one type of justice, indeed, that they should harm no one else by inflicting injury, but they fall into another, for hindered by their devotion to learning, they abandon those whom they ought to protect. And so he thinks that they should not even embark upon public life unless they are forced to do so. But that is something done more fairly when done voluntarily. For something that is done rightly is only just if it is voluntary. There are also some who, whether through devotion to preserving their personal wealth or through some kind of dislike of mankind, claim to be attending to their own business and appear to do no one any injustice. But though they are free from one type of injustice, they run into another. Such men abandon the fellowship of life, because they contribute to it nothing of their devotion, nothing of their effort, nothing of their means. Since we have set out the two types of injustice and added the causes of each, and since we established previously what are the things that constitute justice, we shall now be able to judge with ease what is our duty on each occasion. That is, if we do not love ourselves too much. For it is difficult to be concerned with another's affairs. Terence's Cremus, however, thinks nothing that is human is another's affair. Yet, in fact, we do tend to notice and feel our own good and bad fortune more than that of others, which we see as if a great distance intervenes. Accordingly, we do not make the same judgments about them and about ourselves. It is good advice, therefore, that prevents you from doing anything if you are unsure whether it is fair or unfair. For fairness shines out by itself, and hesitation signifies that one is contemplating injustice. Occasions often arise when the actions that seem most worthy of a just man, of him whom we call good, undergo a change, and the opposite becomes the case. For example, from time to time, it becomes just to set aside such requirements as the returning of a deposit, or the carrying out of a promise, or other things that relate to truth and to keeping faith, and not to observe them. For it is seemly that they should be referred to those fundamentals of justice that I laid down at the beginning. First, that one should harm no one, and secondly, that one served the common advantage. Such actions alter with the circumstances, and duty alters likewise, and is not invariable. For it can happen that something that has been promised and agreed, if carried out, would be disadvantageous to the person to whom the promise has been made, or else to him who gave the promise. If Neptune in the myth had not done what he had promised to Theseus, Theseus would not have been deprived of his son Hippolytus. He made 3 wishes, as we read, and the third was this. He wished in his anger that Hippolytus should die. When it was granted, he fell into the deepest grief. Therefore, promises should not be kept if they are disadvantageous to those to whom you have made them, nor if they harm you more than they benefit the person whom you have promised. Is it contrary to duty to prefer the greater good to the lesser? For example, if you had made an appointment to appear for someone as advocate in the near future, and in the meantime your son had fallen seriously ill, it would not be contrary to your duty not to do as you had said. Rather, the person to whom you made the promise would be failing in his duty if he complained that he had been abandoned. Again, who does not see that if someone is forced to make a promise through fear, or deceived into it by trickery, the promise ought not to stand? One is released from such promises in most cases by the praetor's code of justice, and sometimes by the laws. Injustices can also arise from a kind of trickery, by an extremely cunning but ill-intentioned interpretation of the law. In consequence, the saying, "the more justice, the more injustice," has by now become a proverb well worn in conversation. Many wrongs of this type are committed even in public affairs. An example is that of the man who, during a truce of 30 days which had been agreed with the enemy, laid waste the fields by night, on the grounds that the truce had been established for days, but not for nights. We should not approve the action even of our own countrymen, if the story is true about Quintus Fabius Labeo, or some other person, for I know of it only from hearsay. He was assigned by the Senate to arbitrate about the boundary between the Nolani and the Neapolitani. When he arrived at the place, he spoke with each group separately, urging it to do nothing out of covetousness or greed, and to be prepared to retreat rather than to advance. When both of them did that, there was some land left in the middle. Therefore, he set a limit to their boundaries exactly where they themselves had set. But he assigned the land that was left in the middle to the people of Rome. That was not arbitration, that was deception. The cleverness of such a king ought in every case to be avoided. Moreover, certain duties must be observed even towards those at whose hands you may have received unjust treatment. There is a limit to revenge and to punishment. I am not even sure that it is not enough, simply that the man who did the harm should repent of his injustice, so that he himself will do no such thing again, and others will be slower to act unjustly. Something else that must very much be preserved in public affairs is the justice of warfare. There are two types of conflict. The one proceeds by debate, the other by force. Since the former is the proper concern of a man, but the latter of beasts, one should only resort to the latter if one may not employ the former. Wars, then, ought to be undertaken for this purpose, that we may live in peace, without injustice. And once victory has been secured, those who were not cruel or savage in warfare should be spared. Thus, our forefathers even received the Tusculani, the Aequi, the Volsci, the Sabini, and the Hernici into citizenship. On the other hand, they utterly destroyed Carthage and Numantia. I would prefer that they had not destroyed Corinth, but I believe that they had some specific purpose in doing so, in particular in view of its advantageous situation, to prevent the location itself from being someday an incitement to war. In my opinion, our concern should always be for a peace that will have nothing to do with treachery. If I had been followed in this, we would still have some republican government, if perhaps not the very best, whereas now we have none. And while you must have concern for those whom you have conquered by force, you must also take in those who have laid down their arms and seek refuge in the faith of generals, although a battering ram may have crushed against their wall. In this matter, justice was respected so greatly among our countrymen that the very men who had received into their good faith cities or peoples conquered in war would, by the custom of our forefathers, become their patrons. Indeed, a fair code of warfare has been drawn up, in full accordance with religious scruple, in the official laws of the Roman people. From this we can grasp that no war is just unless it is waged after a formal demand for restoration, or unless it has been formally announced and declared beforehand. When Popilius was general in charge of a province, Cato's son was serving as a novice soldier in his army. Popilius then decided to dismiss one of the legions and included in the dismissal the young Cato, who was serving in that legion. But when, out of love of fighting, he remained in the army, Cato wrote to Popilius, saying that if he allowed him to stay in the army, he should bind him by a fresh military oath, since he could not in justice fight the enemy when his former oath had become void. Such were their extreme scrupulousness when making war. There actually exists a letter of the elder Marcus Cato to the younger Marcus, in which he writes that he has heard that his son, who was serving in Macedonia in the war against Perseus, had been discharged by the consul. He warns him, therefore, to be careful not to enter battle. For, he says, it is not lawful for one who is not a soldier to fight with the enemy. A further point is that the name given to someone who ought properly to have been called the foe, perduellis, is in fact hostis. I notice that the grimness of the fact is lessened by the gentleness of the word. For hostis meant to our forefathers he whom we now call a stranger. The 12 tables show this. For example, a day appointed for trial with a hostis. And again, right of ownership cannot be alienated in favor of a hostis. What greater courteousness could there be than to call him against whom you are waging a war by so tender a name? Long usage, however, has made the name harsher, for the word has abandoned the stranger, and now makes it proper home with who bears arms against you. When, then, we are fighting for empire and seeking glory through warfare, those grounds that I mentioned a little above, as just grounds for war, should be wholly present. But wars in which the goal is the glory of empire are waged less bitterly. For just as in civilian matters we may compete in one way with an enemy, in another with a rival, for the latter contest is for honor and standing, the former for one's civic life or reputation. Similarly, the wars against the Celtiberi and the Cimbri were waged with enemies. The question was not who would rule, but who would exist. With the Latins, Sabini, Samnites, Carthaginians, and Pyrrhus, on the other hand, the dispute was over empire. The Carthaginians were breakers of truces, and Hannibal was cruel, but the others were more just. Indeed, Pyrrhus's words about the returning of the captives were splendid. "My demand is not for gold, nor shall you give me a price. Let us each determine our lives by iron, not by gold, not by selling, but by fighting war. Let us test by our virtue whether Mistress Fortune wishes you or me to reign, or what she may bring. Hear these words too. If the fortune of war spares the virtue of any, take it as certain that I shall spare them their liberty. Take them as a gift, and I give them with the will of the great gods." That is certainly the view of a king, and one worthy of the race of the Aequidii. If any individuals have been constrained by circumstance to promise anything to an enemy, they must keep faith even in that. Indeed, Regulus did so when he was captured by the Carthaginians in the First Punic War, and was sent to Rome for the purpose of arranging an exchange of captives, having vowed that he would return. For first of all, upon his arrival, he proposed in the Senate that the captives should not be returned, and then, when his friends and relatives were trying to keep him, he preferred to go back to his punishment and to break the faith he had given to an enemy. In the Second Punic War, after the Battle of Cannae, Hannibal sent to Rome 10 men, bound by a solemn oath that they would return if they did not succeed in arranging for those whom the Romans had captured to be ransomed. The census disenfranchised all of them for the rest of their lives, on the grounds that they had broken their oath. They treated similarly one of them, who incurred blame by fraudulently evading his solemn oath. For after leaving the camp with Hannibal's permission, he returned a little later, saying that he had forgotten something or other. He then considered that he had released himself from his oath on leaving the camp, but he had done so only in word and not in fact. For on the question of keeping faith, you must always think of what you meant, not of what you said. Another very great example of justice towards an enemy was established by our forefathers when a deserter from Pyrrhus promised the Senate that he would kill the king by giving him poison. Fabricius and the Senate returned him to Pyrrhus. In the way, they did not give approval to the killing in a criminal way of even a powerful enemy, and one who was waging war unprovoked. Enough has been said about the duties of war. Let us remember also that justice must be maintained even towards the lowliest. the lowliest condition and fortune is that of slaves. The instruction we are given to treat them as if they were employees is good advice, that one should require work from them and grant to them just treatment. There are two ways in which injustice may be done, either through force or through deceit, and deceit seems to belong to a little fox, force to a lion. Both of them seem most alien to a human being, but deceit deserves a greater hatred, and out of all injustice nothing deserves punishment more than that of men who, just at the time when they are most betraying trust, act in such a way that they might appear to be good men. I have now said enough about justice. Next, I must do as I proposed, and speak about beneficence and liberality. Nothing is more suited to human nature than this, but there are many caveats. For first one must see that kindness harms neither the very people whom one seems to be treating kindly, nor others. Next, that one's kindness does not exceed one's capabilities, and then that kindness is bestowed upon each person according to his standing. Indeed, that is fundamental to justice, to which all these things ought to be referred. For those who do someone a favor in such a way that they harm him whom they appear to want to assist should be judged neither beneficent nor liberal, but dangerous flatterers. Those who, in order to be liberal towards some, harm others, fall into the same injustice as if they had converted someone else's possessions to their own account. There are, though, many, especially those greedy for renown and glory, who steal from one group the very money that they lavish upon another. They think that they will appear beneficent towards their friends if they enrich them by any method whatsoever. But that is so far from being a duty that, in fact, nothing could be more opposed to duty. We should therefore see that the liberality we exercise in assisting our friends does not harm anyone. Consequently, the transference of money by Lucius Sulla and Gaius Caesar from its lawful owners to others ought not to be seen as liberal. Nothing is liberal if it is not also just. The second need for caution is for fear one's kindness exceeds one's capabilities. For those who want to be kinder than their possessions allow, first go wrong by being unjust to those nearest to them. They transfer to strangers resources which would more fairly be provided for or left to them. Usually, there lurks within such liberality a greediness to plunder and deprive unjustly, so that resources may be available for lavish gifts. One can see that most men are not so much liberal by nature as drawn by a kind of glory. And in order to be seen to be beneficent, they do many things that appear to stem not from goodwill, but from ostentation. Such pretense is closer to sham than to either liberality or honorableness. The third point I had laid down was that one should, when exercising beneficence, make choices according to standing. Here we should look both at the conduct of the man on whom we are conferring a kindness, and at the spirit in which he views us, at the association and fellowship of our lives together, and at the dutiful services that he has previously carried out for our benefit. It is desirable that all such considerations should come together. If they do not, then the more numerous and more important grounds will carry more weight. Since we do not live with men who are perfect and clearly wise, but with those who are doing splendidly, if they have in them mere images of virtue, I think that we must understand this too. No one should be wholly neglected if any indication of virtue appears in him. Moreover, one must particularly foster those who are most graced with the gentler virtues, modesty, restraint, and that very justice which I have now been discussing at length. For a brave and great spirit in a man who is not perfect nor wise is generally too impetuous. But those other virtues seem rather to attach themselves to a good man. That is all on the question of conduct. On the subject of the goodwill that each person has toward us, the first consideration of duty is that we should grant the most to the one who is most fond of us. But we should judge goodwill not as adolescents do, by the strength of its burning passion, but rather by its firmness and constancy. If services have already been rendered, that is, if you have not to inspire gratitude, but rather to requite it, then you must take even greater care. For no duty is more necessary than that of requiting gratitude. For if, as Hesiod commands, you should return in greater measure, provided that you can, anything that you have needed to borrow, what should we do when challenged by an unsought favor? Should we not take as our model the fertile fields, which bring forth much more than they have received? We do not hesitate to perform dutiful services for those whom we hope will assist us in the future. What, then, ought we to be like towards those who have already assisted us? There are two aspects of liberality. First, granting a kind service, and secondly, returning it. Whether we grant one or not is up to us. A good man, however, is not permitted to fail to return one, provided, of course, that he can do so without injustice. We must, moreover, discriminate between kind services we have received, and there is no doubt but that the greater the kindness, the more is owed to its bestower. Here we must first of all weigh up the spirit in which each man has acted, his devotion and his good will. For many men do many things out of a certain rashness, failing to use their judgment, or may be inspired by a frenzied or sudden impulse of the spirit towards everyone, like a gust of wind. Such favors should not be considered as important as those that are conferred through judgment, without forethought and constancy. In granting favors, on the other hand, and in requiting gratitude, the most important function of duty, if all else is equal, is to enrich above all the person who is most in need of riches. But people generally do exactly the opposite, for they defer above all to him from whom they expect the most, even though he does not need them. Also, the fellowship between men and their common bonding will best be preserved if the closer someone is to you, the more kindness you confer upon him. Perhaps, though, we should examine more thoroughly what are the natural principles of human fellowship and community. First is something that is seen in the fellowship of the entire human race. For its bonding consists of reason and speech, which reconcile men to one another through teaching, learning, communicating, debating, and making judgments, and unite them in a kind of natural fellowship. It is this that most distances us from the nature of other animals. To them we often impute courage, as with horses or lions, but we do not impute to them justice, fairness, or goodness, for they have no share in reason and speech. The most widespread fellowship existing among men is that of all with all others. Here we must preserve the communal sharing of all the things that nature brings forth for the common use of mankind, in such a way that whatever is assigned by statutes and civil law should remain in such possession as those laws may have laid down, but the rest should be regarded as the Greek proverb has it: everything is common among friends. The things that are common to all men seem to be of the kind that Ennius defines in one case, from which we can extrapolate to many cases. A man who kindly shows the path to someone who is lost lights another's light, so to speak, from his own, for his own shines no less because he has lit another's. With this one instance, he advises that if any assistance can be provided without detriment to oneself, it should be given even to a stranger. Therefore, such things as the following are to be shared. One should not keep others from fresh water, should allow them to take fire from your fire, should give trustworthy counsel to someone who is seeking advice, for they are useful to those who receive them and cause no trouble to the giver. We should therefore both make use of them and always be contributing something to the common benefit. Since, though the resources of individuals are small, but the mass of those who are in need is infinitely great, general liberality must be measured according to the limit laid down by Ennius, that his own light shines no less. Then we shall still be capable of being liberal to those close to us. There are indeed several degrees of fellowship among men. To move from the one that is unlimited, next there is a closer one of the same race, tribe, and tongue, through which men are bound strongly to one another. More intimate still is that of the same city, as citizens have many things that are shared with one another: the forum, temples, porticos and roads, laws and legal rights, law courts and political elections, and besides these, acquaintances and companionship, and those business and commercial transactions that many of them make with many others. A tie narrower still is that of the fellowship between relations. Moving from that vast fellowship of the human race, we end up with a confined and limited one. For since it is by nature common to all animals that they have a drive to procreate, the first fellowship exists within marriage itself, and the next with one's children. Then there is the one house in which everything is shared. Indeed, that is the principle of a city and the seedbed, as it were, of a political community. Next, there follow bonds between brothers, and then between first cousins and second cousins, who cannot be contained in one house and go out to other houses, as if to colonies. Finally, there follow marriages and those connections of marriage, from which even more relations arise. In such propagation and increase, political communities have their origin. Moreover, the bonding of blood holds men together by goodwill and by love, for it is a great thing to have the same ancestral memorials, to practice the same religious rites, and to share common ancestral tombs. Of all fellowships, however, none is more important, and none stronger, than when good men of similar conduct are bound by familiarity. For honorableness, the thing that I so often mention, moves us, even if we see it in someone else, and makes us friends of him in whom it seems to reside. All virtue indeed lures us to itself, and leads us to love those in whom it seems to reside, but justice and liberality do so the most. Moreover, nothing is more lovable, and nothing more tightly binding, than similarity in conduct that is good. For when men have similar pursuits and inclinations, it comes about that each one is as much delighted with the other as he is with himself. The result is what Pythagoras wanted in friendship, that several be united into one. Important also are the common bonds that are created by kindness reciprocally given and received, which, provided that they are mutual and gracefully received, bind together those concerned in an unshakable fellowship. But when you have surveyed everything with reason and spirit, of all fellowships, none is more serious and none dearer than that of each of us with a republic. Parents are dear, and children, relatives and acquaintances are dear, but our country has on its own embraced all the affections of all of us. What good man would hesitate to face death on her behalf if it would do her a service? How much more detestable, then, is the monstrousness of those who have savaged their country with all the manner of crime, and who have been, and are still, engaged in destroying her utterly. Now, were there a comparison or competition as to who ought most to receive our dutiful services, our country and our parents would be foremost, for we are obliged to them for the greatest kindnesses. Next would be our children and our whole household, which looks to us alone and can have no other refuge. Then our relations, who are congenial to us, and with whom even our fortunes are generally shared. Therefore, whatever is necessary to support life is most owed to those whom I have just mentioned. On the other hand, a shared life and a shared living, counsel and conversation, encouragement, comfort, and sometimes even reproofs flourish most of all in friendships. And friendship is most pleasing when it is cemented by similarity of conduct. But one ought, when bestowing all these dutiful services, to look at what each person most greatly needs, and what each would or would not be able to secure without our help. Thus, the degrees of ties of relationship will be not the same as those of circumstance. Some duties are owed to one group of people rather than to another. You should, for example, assist your neighbor sooner than your brother or companion in gathering his harvest. But you should, in a suit in the law courts, defend a relative or friend rather than your neighbor. In every case of duty, therefore, considerations such as these ought to be examined, and we should adopt this habit, and should practice so that we can become good calculators of our duties, and can see, by adding and subtracting, what is the sum that remains. From this you can understand how much is owed to each person. But neither doctors, nor generals, nor orators are able, however much they have taken to heart advice about their art, to achieve anything very worthy of praise without experience and practice. Similarly, advice on observing duty certainly has been handed down, as I myself am now handing it down. But a matter of such importance also demands experience and practice. And now I have said enough on the question of how honorableness, upon which duty hangs, is derived from those things that constitute the justice of human fellowship.